The last thing I have on the notes is the changing music situation in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, we see that first wave of rock and roll kind of fade away. Elvis ends up going into the military. Little Richard becomes a preacher. Jerry Lee Lewis is blacklisted for marrying his 13-year-old cousin. Chuck Berry goes to jail. It's just like that first wave is just completely wiped out. And then you see a rise in this new R&B flavored portion of rock and roll. Some of the early 60s bands that are R&B influenced are people like the Drifters, who of course sing this one.
This magic moment, so different and so new, was like any other.
Really smooth. Okay. Of course, the most famous one from that band. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Was the guy that was the lead singer was a guy named Ben E. King. He sang this famous tune.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see.
So a lot smoother. You also get an addition of a wider range of instruments. Kettle drums, bells, violins. Pretty sure some good strings here. Something that you probably would not have heard in 1950s rock and roll. And then you get this new type of music that is more producer driven. There was a guy named Phil Spector who was known for this. And he was a producer of a lot of girl groups in the 1960s. Also, he did some work with some male groups. But early 1960s, it was young black females who were dominating the airwaves. You had bands like the Ronettes who came up with sang songs like Be My Baby that were big hits. Whoops. Let's try that again. Be My Baby. There we go. And one of the important parts of Phil Spector's music and music of bands like the Ronettes was the wall of sound. So all this background noise kind of sounds like a rumbling of sound. That was called the wall of sound, and it was like his idea was let's just overpower the microphone with all these different instruments, 7 pianos, 3 drummers, 5 horn players, whatever. We're going to just overload the microphone with musical instruments, and it would come together in this kind of rumbling wall of sound that he became known for. And like another good example is this one's called Da Do Ron Ron by the Crystals. There's that rumbling sound. So that's Phil Spector and the Wall of Sound. The songs were driven by the producer. He was kind of a wild guy. kind of abusive as well. He used to just like record songs with some singers and give them to other singers. The most famous example of this is a woman named Darlene Love. Since it's holiday time right now, this is pretty relevant. She sang a song or recorded a song for Phil Spector called Christmas, Baby Please Come Home. Here it is. There's the wall of sound. And so this woman who's about to sing wonderful singer, okay, super powerful voice. She records this song, and one day she's driving in the car and she hears it and she thinks, I made it to superstardom. But then she hears who they say sang it, and on the radio they said that song was by the Crystals. And she never got the credit for it because Phil Spector took her recording, slapped the Crystals' name on it, and gave it to them as a hit. And she never saw the fame and stardom and credit she deserved. And she never saw it until, I think 40 years later, when she was, finally given the credit based on people digging up the fact that she actually recorded it. There's a great show, I think it's called 20 Feet from Stardom, where it focuses on people like backup singers during this time period. And she was one example that, she was, when she was in her 40s and 50s, she was cleaning houses. And she would hear this song while she was cleaning houses during the holidays. And it would just make her extremely sad to know that she sang it, but no one ever knew. But eventually she got the credit she deserved. And it just highlights the, carelessness of Phil Spector as well. During this time period, a lot of other girl groups, very popular. You've got, let's see here, 1960s music. You've got groups like the Chiffons. Okay. Let's see who else we got here on my playlist of 60s music. You've got groups like the Crystals. Got the Shirelles. This is a good one. Will You Love Me Tomorrow? So that kind of highlights the girl group sound of the 60s and the early 60s and the R&B feel there. And then, of course, as the 60s progress, you see something called the British Invasion, where a bunch of British bands end up coming into the U.S. and they start playing their music. And that's, of course, led by this band, the Beatles. So they come over and they take American culture by storm. Everybody loves the Beatles. Doesn't matter if you're black, you're white, you're Latino. You're listening to the Beatles and you're singing along, and you're doing the whoos with them. So they are a cultural phenomenon. They are One Direction before One Direction. They're bigger than One Direction. Who am I kidding? They're also bigger than Elvis. And what basically is happening is all these British bands that come over along with the Beatles, they end up capturing the earlier sound of rock and roll. So I talked about this before with the start of rock and roll, where people would hear certain music and they would play their version of it. That's what these British bands were doing. They were hearing Chuck Berry. They were hearing Muddy Waters. They were hearing Elvis. They were hearing Little Richard. And they would hear that, and they would play their version of it. and then the Americans would just eat it up. But the Beatles were not the only British band. You had bands like Herman's Hermits, who also came over and actually outsold the Beatles for a little bit. This one's Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter.
Mrs. Brown, you've got a lovely daughter. Girls as sharp as her are something rare.
You also had bands like the Kinks, who were more rock and roll. Here we go.
I'm not content to be with you in the daytime. Girl, I want to be with you all of the time. The only time I feel alright is by your side. Girl, I want to be with you all of the time, all day and all of the night.
And there was bands like the Animals as well, who are pretty gritty. But we talked about this song as it was a folk song in America back in the 30s or 40s, but they took it and made it their own. House of the Rising Sun.
There is a house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun, and it's been the ruin of many a poor boy. In God, I know I'm one.
So you have the British invasion that comes in and totally shakes up the American music scene. And they become super popular all across the country, all those British bands. But then, of course, you have, friendly rivalries that are sparked by this British invasion that add to the mix. You have bands like the Beach Boys who hear the Beatles. Like one example is the guy who wrote the songs for the Beach Boys was a guy named Brian Wilson. And he would hear the albums of the Beatles like Rubber Soul, which were, a little deeper in terms of songwriting, and he heard that and he was like, let's make our version of that. And he would come up with things like this.
I may not always love you, but long as there are stars above you, you never need to doubt it. I'll make
Which is a
you
pretty
such
complex arrangement. So one of the things you see here is, more producers getting in the mix. You also see the artists becoming the producers, and you also see the lyrics of songs, changing from "Oh baby, baby, I love you, baby" to a little bit more deeper meaning and folk song based rock and roll, where they've got lyrics that aren't just superficial. There's a little bit of hidden meaning sometimes. That could be highlighted with this one from the Beatles, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." The key for this one is in the title, Lucy, Sky, Diamonds.
With tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A girl with kaleidoscope eyes.
So music goes through quite the evolution in the 60s. Arrangement-wise, lyrically, the idea of a concept album comes out where it's important to have songs that play into one another and they are put in a specific order for a reason. And then, of course, also during this entire 60s period, you've got, one of the most influential African-American labels known as Motown coming out and just dominating as well with any number of hits. It's the Temptations. And I mean, you can't really go wrong with a Motown playlist. You got the Temptations, you got the Supremes.
I need love to ease my mind. I need to find
They come up with this formula, this almost assembly line of making music, where there's songwriters, there's a funky house band, there's artists to sing all these songs that are being written for them, and they just make hit after hit after hit, and they create star after star after star. It's pretty amazing. Probably my favorite record label of all time. Yeah, good luck not singing along to this one. Come on. Of course, that's Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. One of the more prolific artists was Stevie Wonder. So, yeah, you could say music was pretty awesome, I think, back in the 60s. Makes a great jump from the 50s and just runs with it. There's a variety of genres that are born and built on in the 60s. And that's going to kind of give you a nice taste of everything in the 60s. I think this music part I might just have to dissect and make as the third part because it's kind of long. But as music goes on, you get also psychedelic rock coming in here at the end of the 60s. You also start to get like metal bands starting to pop up, or heavy metal, or more rock bands. Of course, I forgot to mention one of the more important Minnesotan acts of the time that has a large influence on people like the Beatles is, of course, Minnesota's own Mr. Bob Dylan, who did a lot for the lyrics of songs. Let's see here. So this one's Bob Dylan, who's got a movie coming out actually on Christmas. So he's got that folk vibe, got that lyrical depth, and a weird voice.
Once upon a time you dressed so fine, threw the bumps of dime in your prime. Then you people call, say beware doll, you're bound to fall. You thought they were all kidding you.
One interesting thing about Bob Dylan was he was strictly acoustic, and then he went electric, and everybody got really mad at him for taking up an electric guitar. But he forced the people to listen to his vision, and they got behind him eventually again. The lyrical depth of his music, though, is probably highlighted best in songs like Blowin' in the Wind, which talks a lot about a lot of the issues of America.
Before you call him a man, how many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
And I'll let him round us out on the topic of music. Good luck on the test, people. Do your best. Just think. Think through the questions. You got this. I believe in you. And have yourselves a great holiday break. In case I don't tell you in person. Thanks for being in my class.
To be free. Yes, and how many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.